I think this needs to become a beautiful live-edged bowl. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I've got this beautiful piece of black walnut that came to me from Chuck in Ohio. Chuck, thanks for making this available. I am greatly appreciative of that, and I think we're going to turn something really beautiful out of this. It's absolutely gorgeous. I believe this has been cut about 3 or 4 months ago, so the bark should be somewhat still in good condition to attempt a live edge bowl. But look how pronounced that bark is. This gets a little tricky when we're doing a live edge with that much bark that's going to extend beyond the edge of the wood. I'm going to try to make this a live edge bowl. Now remember, you can try for a live edge bowl, and if for some reason you don't get all the bark to stay on, you can always remove the bark and then you'll have a natural edge bowl. There's nothing wrong with a natural edge bowl. It's kind of a fun challenge to try to leave the bark on and create a live edge bowl, and that's what we're going to start with initially. Now, one of the things I need to do is I'm going to mount this to the lathe. I want to make sure I'm centering it up well, so I'm going to need to move it around a lot. So I'm not going to put a face plate on here. Instead, I'm going to put it between centers, but I got to remove some of this bark before I put it on the lathe. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Let's go ahead and get started. The easiest way to get this bark off is to use a chisel and a hammer. In this case, I'm actually using a mallet that I made on the lathe with some Osage orange, which is a really hard wood. It's perfect for the mallet. So I'm going to just take my time and chisel this away. Now, if you notice what I'm doing is I'm cutting into this bark from both sides. I don't want to try to pry it up and flip it off of there because the bark tends to stay in large sections, and we could easily just strip it across the entire top, and that would damage the edges where we want to leave the bark for this live edge bowl. So you want to take your time and kind of go back and forth and carve it out, chisel it out, and get down to that sapwood, which you're seeing right here. Okay, so I'm going to put my 4-spur drive center in the lathe, and I'm going to line up the center of this. Now, I took a little bit of time and I measured where that center was on both the top and the bottom. And I'm going to use my tailstock and bring it up there. Now, the reason I'm doing this between centers is that I want to be able to make minor adjustments. It's time for my 55-degree bevel swept back bull gouge. Yeah, there's an animation now, which, why not, right? This is my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bull gouge, and I'm going to use that to rough out this piece. Now, the edges of this are uneven, and they will kick the gouge around quite a bit. So you want to pay attention to that as you're working. The trick to prevent that from happening is to make nice smooth motions from, in this case, from right to left, and to put down pressure into the tool rest so the bowl blank is not allowed to move that gouge around. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind when you're between centers is you want to tighten up that tailstock frequently, especially when you first start turning, because the 4-spur drive center will take a little bit of time to dig into the bowl itself. So you can tighten that up so that it doesn't come loose. If it comes loose, it's going to wobble around or possibly even come off the lathe, and obviously we don't want that. So take your time, make a pass or two, and then check it and tighten it up even more as you go. Just keep an eye on that, especially when you get started, because those teeth are going to dig in there and you'll have some play that starts to occur. You can see that uneven edge right there and how it's bouncing the gouge just a little bit. And then once you get into a continuous cut, it's not so bad. But then we come out to some uneven material again, and it wants to smack the gouge around. The key again is to apply down pressure into that tool rest. The other thing that we're not doing is we're not moving our hands or our arms. At this point, the gouge is locked in, my arms are locked into a position, and I'm shifting my body weight. I'm actually flexing my knees and just shifting from right to left. That's going to make a nice, controlled, very smooth pass. I've got a video all about how to move your body when you're turning. You're going to want to check that out. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here initially is get this bottom curve shape established. It's doing a couple things. It's going to help me with the design of the bowl. I can start seeing where everything is going to be placed and positioned and what I have to work with, but it also gets that material out of the way so that I can move the tool rest and the banjo and get that right into the positions that I want as I'm turning. So I like to come back and look at this particular angle and make sure that I've got a good curve that's established and a good shape to the overall bowl at this point. Which brings up another really good point is when you start a cut like this, it's okay to look down at the tool as you're starting, but then you don't want to look at the tool the entire time. You want to look across the bowl to the top edge and the curve that's being created and see if that corresponds with the shape that you're trying to create. It's kind of like watching your feet when you're riding a bicycle. You really don't want to be looking at the pedals as you're pedaling. You want to be looking at the road in front of you. Okay, so I've got a high spot, and I've got it. Now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a pass from the left to the right. And this is a little unusual because this is not a grain supported cut. If you've seen my video all about the supported grain cut, then you know what I'm talking about. It's worth checking that out after this video if you haven't seen it already. What I'm doing here, and the purpose for doing this technically unsupported cut, is to keep that bark on. If I move from the right to the left, which is a supported cut, when I get to the edge of the bowl, I'm pushing against that bark away from the wood, and I'm going to pop that bark right off the blank itself, and then we won't have a live edge bowl. Instead, I'm going to make a right to left pass, which is an unsupported cut. And while I'm doing this, I'm basically just pushing the bark up against the wood surface itself, so it's less likely to come off the edge at this point when I'm doing this pass. It's actually pretty wild because there's a strobe effect that's occurring between the light that I'm using, the camera speed, and the lathe speed, and you could actually see as I was cutting. I've got a little bit of a low spot there I need to take care of. It looks like you can actually see the bowl itself or the curve, but of course in real life you don't see that at all. You just have a very faint visual on the edge there, and you want to pick up and make really light passes. All right, that looks good. That's looking good on both sides. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check where the wings are, the top of the wings. I can see there's a gap there. I don't want that gap. I want the top of each wing to be in the same spot. And this side's a little bit high. So this is why I use that drive center. I can loosen this up and adjust it just a little bit. And then I can go back and check it and make sure those wings are lined up with one another. And they are now. It's one of those things, it's a very subtle thing to do, but it really makes it worth it when you're doing a live edge or a natural edge bowl, is take the time and balance out those wings and make sure that they are at the same height. If you have one that's a little bit higher than the other one, it just looks odd. So you don't really want that. And now because I did change the axis of this bowl, I want to go ahead and make one other light pass here to establish that top edge. And now that I have the top edge established, I'm going to remove this material and merge that up to the top edge. So now I'm working from the base up to the rim, and I'm going to take my time and make nice supported cuts. I'm going to be doing two things here, removing material and also taking the design and the shape of this bowl and matching it up with the rim. So hopefully you guys understand what I'm talking about here. That top edge, those wings of the bowl, you can see that that bark is just delicately up on the top of that. If I pushed up against that, going in the direction I'm cutting right now, I'm just going to knock that bark right off of it. I'm taking some pretty deep passes here because I'm just roughing that material off, and it's slowing down the lathe. That's why you saw that that speed change right there. I'm going to clean up the face of this again. Again, this is shifted just a little bit, so it's not perfectly flat. So I'll just go ahead and make a nice face cleaning pass here. And then we'll establish the tenon and shoulder areas. I'm going to use my dividers to mark where the tenon will go. Remember, only touch the left side of the dividers. If you let that other side touch, you're going to have dividers flying, and they're probably going to be flying at you, so you don't want that. Just let the left side touch and scribe a line. And what you're doing is you're lining up the right side, just eyeballing it, and you want that scribed line to be over the side of the right side as well, so that way you've transferred that width. So I'm going to just quickly shape the tenon and the shoulder, and then I'm going to get back to removing this material to shape the final bowl. Now the shoulder and the tenon will become the foot of the bowl. I had a moment there where the camera wasn't running and I started making this cut. Basically just removing this material to start merging the shoulder, which will become the foot of the bowl, up to the rim. The best way to think about this is like connecting the dots. When you establish your foot and you establish the rim of the bowl, then you basically just need to connect the dots, and you can connect them in a variety of different ways. I like to make a smooth, natural looking fluid curve shape. And here again, kind of backing up so you can see the shape of this, looking at the top edge as this is being formed. I still need to remove more material to get down to that level that was established on the top rim. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm sharpening my gouge frequently, especially when I'm up near that bark area. I want the gouge to be slicing that bark versus ripping it or pushing it off of there. It's not quite down low enough, but we're getting really close. So I'm going to make another pass here. Clean up the bottom edge here where it's connecting into the foot, or where it will connect into the foot. I'm using a little scraping cut there to get that material out of the way, and then I turn the gouge around and make a pushing cut. Now I'm using my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And I'm watching the depth of the top portion. And I don't want to take off too much material here because I don't want to go through that too quickly. So I'm going to just very carefully just remove a very thin slice of this, and then we'll see where we are. That's close, not quite there. I can still have a little bit of a high spot that needs to be removed. That wood is absolutely gorgeous. One of the things that I didn't realize about walnut is the very graphic layering of bark lines. It's interesting, you actually see the growth in the bark as well as the grains of the wood, of course. I'm making a really light pass here just to get that last bit off, to get it really close to the previous depth. And it's bringing it really, really close. Okay, that can be addressed with the shear scrape. I'm going to go back to my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge to do my shear scrape here. The shear scrape is designed to just lightly shave away material and return a surface back to a really, really nice smooth condition. You can see where I have that high and low spot right here. I'm just going to use this. You can see the angle of the gouge is about 45 degrees with the handle downward. That is a shear scrape. And I'm only using the bottom edge and just letting it lightly shave away this material. It's shaving away so lightly that you can move the gouge back and forth, left and right, and you don't have to worry about tearing out any kind of grain. Now keep in mind, look at how I just erased that line. And we went right over the bark with that as well. So you want to be really, really careful in your location of the gouge when you're doing that. I'm going to use my spindle detail gouge now to establish the angle for the tenon. This angle is designed to match the angle of my 4-jaw chuck so that it grips this properly when we go ahead and reverse that, which we'll be doing next. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and pop this off the lathe and get my chuck set up. It's looking really, really good. I love the contrast of the dark heartwood and the light sapwood on this walnut blank. It's just a beautiful piece of wood. You want to make sure that you don't have any debris on the sides of your tenon that get inside the chuck, because that will change the orientation and the rotation of the bowl. Okay, so using my heavier 5/8 inch bowl gouge, I'm going to make some cuts to cut that bark. Remember when I was saying at the beginning, when you're chiseling off the bark, you don't want to get too aggressive and try to take big chunks of it off, because there's a good chance you'll lift off a big section of it. And if you do that, you're probably going to damage some of the bark that's along the edge of the bowl, and we want to avoid that. So what I'm doing right now is I'm kind of slicing through sections of that, and I'm going to get rid of some of the bark in the center here so we get down to some of that sapwood. But I'm going to work from the inside out to that edge, just going through the bark, so that we make nice clean cuts and we don't tear any of this bark out. You can see how it's cutting it nicely there. I want to sharpen up my tools, both of them. Now I also have a tool sharpening and shaping course. If you want to learn how to take any bowl gouge and turn it into your own 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, in my tool sharpening course I will show you exactly how to do that. I'll show you how to shape a whole variety of other profiles as well. Tool sharpening is one of the things you really need to learn first and get it down so it's second nature, so it's very easy for you to come to the sharpening station like this and sharpen your tools, return them to sharpness very quickly, and then get back to work on the lathe. Because unfortunately, if you don't have sharp tools, you're going to be struggling while turning, and that's never fun. So once you establish a really good tool sharpening techniques, it makes everything that much easier. And in the course of this turning, I've sharpened my tools several times. Walnut is relatively hard, and it does dull the tools somewhat quickly. But as you just saw, it's not that big of a deal to go back and freshen up that nice sharp edge. So I'm going to gradually rough out this bark top edge. And I'm doing that again so I can sneak up on it, making sure that, like I said, that cutting edge is nice and sharp, and it's slicing through that top bark edge. The top of those wings seems to be the most vulnerable wood. In my experience of doing live edge bowls, that wood seems to be the wood that will break away first and disappear. So now, as I'm getting closer to what I think will be my final wall thickness, I want to make lighter and lighter passes. I'm going to get some of this material out of the way here so I can go down a little bit deeper in the bowl. Now this is where I established my technique of clearing the bowl out from the outer rim first and then removing material on the inside of the bowl. It's from doing live edge and natural edge bowls. One of the things that I guess you could do it. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I'm sure there's people that can do it. But if you're doing a live edge bowl like this, you think of those wings that are out there, they're very unsupported. And because there's gaps in the side walls of the rims of the bowl, those wings are going to flex, especially if this wood is relatively freshly cut and contains a lot of moisture. and or if I make those walls really thin. So to alleviate that problem and to cut those walls to the right thickness with having support, I leave the core or the center of the bowl in place. If you think about it, the center mass is actually providing a lot of stability right here. And when I can make really delicate cuts like this, if those wings start flapping around, I'm done. I can't go back out there and do anything to them. As a matter of fact, when I get to the point of taking this middle portion out of the bowl, if I do attempt to go back to one of those wings because they're flexing, and if I'm holding my tool steady and stable on the tool rest, it's going to be like a collision essentially with those wings. And that's how people have bowls that quote unquote blow up, is because they're introducing a very stable tool to a flexing piece of wood, and that flexing piece of wood is what's going to give. So we don't want to do that. Instead, what I like to do is I like to start up at the rim, establish my wall thickness, and then gradually work down the side of the bowl and just establish that same thickness in each section that I work on. Clear out some material and then work a little bit farther down inside the bowl, and then just continue on down all the way to the very bottom of the bowl. At no point do I go all the way back up to that top rim and try to address it in any way. Because right now there's flexing in those wings. It may not be visible to our eye, but there's definitely flexing in those wings. And now as I remove that center mass, it's going to flex even more. But because I've already established the wall thickness and I've done everything that I need to do up there, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to return up there. So it's okay if they flex a bit. Which brings up a really good point, is you want to keep your lathe speed set not too high, and you definitely don't want to exceed 1,000 RPMs ever. I've got a video all about the lathe speed for turning wood bowls, and it is super critical that you understand that the speed of which you can turn a bowl compared to the speed of which you can turn a spindle on the lathe is much different. And if you come to bowl turning from a spindle background and you try to turn the bowl as fast as you can turn spindles, you could potentially get yourself in a lot of trouble. So check out that video about the wood lathe speed. Oh, got a little too aggressive there and stopped the lathe there. I don't know if it didn't stop the motor. I don't know if my belt skipped. It most likely did. You can get a little bit aggressive if you'd like with removing and roughing out material. You don't want to get too aggressive there. It was a little bit too deep of a bite that I took. So now what I'm doing is I'm just sneaking down to the wall thickness in this particular section. I just want to get down in there, and then I'm going, like I said, I'm going to continue that wall thickness from the rim and maintain that same thickness throughout the entire bowl. As you get closer to the inside final wall, your cuts should become lighter and more precise. If you notice, I backed up just a little bit there, and what I'm doing is I'm just rubbing the bevel to establish where the cutting edge is right before it goes into that new fresh area that's a little bit higher. And that way I can merge those areas in with one another. You can take that core down in the center. The other nice thing about doing this is it uses both sides of the cutting tip on the gouge. Right here, when I'm making the nice final pass or the cuts inside, I'm using the right side of the nose of the gouge. And by the way, this is the angle of which I'm looking at the cut. I'm not bending over and looking into the bowl because I can't really tell where the gouge is. But from this angle, I can tell where the gouge is in relation to the exterior of the bowl. And what I'm doing is I'm aligning the bevel of the gouge up and making it parallel to the exterior surface of the bowl. And that way I know that I'm making a parallel curve inside the bowl. Now, it's a great idea to stop frequently and check your thickness. What you want right here is the bottom of that wall that's cleaned off should have a thicker area, and you're going to gently remove that until it matches everything else. I've switched my tool rest out for my longer J tool rest. This gives me a little bit more access deeper into a larger bowl like this. At this point, the center core has given us all the support it needs to give us for the wings, and we're not going to use it anymore. Actually, you can see this because of the effects of the light and the camera and the lathe speed. You can actually see those wings are kind of wobbling a little bit. They are vibrating right now. You absolutely do not want to bring the tool back up to the top edge of this bowl, because you will, at a minimum, break off the bark, and you potentially could just rip off one of those wings. It's always a good idea to take your time with the tool rest and get the height just right. You want that cutting edge of your tool to be on the center line, and that's how you adjust your tool rest. There's a lot of other things you need to know about the tool rest, and I've got a video all about that. You might want to check that out as well. So what I was saying is, when you're doing those passes that you saw right there, push cuts into the headstock, you're actually using the left side of the gouge. So you're using that gouge tip on both sides pretty well, and it's nice because you can have that left side can be nice and sharp, and then when you return to do the inside, the right side sharp. Now I've switched over to my 5/8 inch micro bevel bowl gouge. This gives me the ability to go in at a much steeper angle. This gouge has a bevel that's at about approximately 65 to 70 degrees. You can see how it looks like it's almost pointing straight into the bowl. That gives me the ability to get away from those wings and reach deep areas inside the bowl. I'm using the same exact technique. I'm working down the next section and getting the depth just right so that it matches the previous area. You can see it's still a little bit high, which is fine. That's all part of the sneaking up on this. I'll have a link for this depth gauge that I use in the description of this video. You take your time and just remove this material. What we're doing is we're sneaking up to the final depth. I only need to remove maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch here to get the inside curve just right. As you can see back there a little bit, I need to merge those sections together, and that's what I'll be doing here in just a moment. But this center is a little bit high, so I'm taking that down first. All right, let's take a look at that. Yeah, still a little high. It's visible, but you can see here and check the depth. If you look at the bottom and the right, the gap between the top and the end of that little silver knob is what we're looking at. I still have plenty of thickness here on the bottom, so I can become a little bit more aggressive with this and remove more material here. We want a nice fluid concave curve in the bottom of the bowl. Again, the interior of this bowl is essentially just going to mimic the exterior. It will be parallel to it. That's why the exterior of the bowl is so important. The exterior of the bowl is the bowl. It's what we see, it's what we touch, it's the pattern that is used to create the interior of the bowl. So that's why we want to take as much time as possible, or however long it takes, to get the exterior of the bowl just right, because it is the bowl. All right, that's looking pretty good. There's a little bit of a line there. I'm going to see if I can merge that together. And take out a little bit more material on the bottom of this curve. You can see how much lighter these cuts have gotten. That's essentially the difference between a roughing cut and a finishing cut, is the depth of the cut, the pace of the cut. Just take your time. You can see here, this is my point of view. I'm looking from this angle. Now, I will tilt my head a little bit as I get down to the center, but I don't want to be looking down into the bowl. I want to see where that tool is in relationship to the exterior of the bowl. All right, you can already see that the curve is much more fluid. The bottom was kind of flat before. Now it's got a nice curve that's matching the exterior of the bowl. The other nice thing about the live edge bowls is you can see them as you're turning. You can see the tool working inside pretty well. Had a little more material that needed to come off there. It's better to leave that, there you go. You don't want to rip that center out. You want to come up to that center nice and smooth, and don't get too aggressive with it. Well, it appears as if the bark actually wants to stay on, which is nice. All right, I'm going to take my time and I'm going to sand this. I'm starting with 120 grit sandpaper. This can be turned with the lathe running. You just got to be careful where that bark is and not go too high on this. The big secret here is to use the edge of the sanding pad to remove tool marks all the way through the bark and that top edge. You can see those lines, those little tool marks in there. You can sand those away. They need to be sanded away with the first grit of sandpaper. If you don't do that, you're going to continually essentially leave those marks in and accentuate them as you go. There you can see the tool lines and the marks. But you can also see how easy it is. Those are the marks. You can see how easy it is to just basically erase them with the edge of the sanding pad. So I went from 120 grit to 180 to 240 to 320. I'm not going to bore you with all of that. It doesn't take very long though. I sanded both the exterior and the interior. I'm going to go ahead and put my jam chuck on the lathe, and I'm going to reverse mount this to get the foot of the bowl established. Now we have a mark there. We got to remember there's two marks because I shifted the bowl just a little bit to balance off those wings. So you got to remember which mark you used and then return to that mark. So I'm going to take the shoulder down and the tenon, and those are both going to become the foot of this bowl. I'm doing push cuts into the headstock. This is actually a very stable way of making these passes that doesn't jostle the mount too much. The jam chuck and tailstock mount, you don't want to dislodge this, obviously. So I'm going to establish the bottom of the foot. And then I'll need to come back and merge that new area with the existing area of the bowl. And the best way to do that is with a scraping cut and a shear scrape. You can see how it's a little bit high there. That's where you want it. Again, we're kind of sneaking up on that. We want to just sneak up and bring it down right to the level that we want. using a very light shear scrape here to take that high area down and blend it in with the rest of the bowl. Take your time here, don't want to get in a rush. And you can see how thin those shavings were. So now we're going to go ahead and sand the area and merge it back together. And we'll deal with the inside bottom of the foot. Now, here's the issue. If I left this foot solid, even with this little curve in it right here, if I left that solid, that foot is much thicker than the walls of the bowl. And what's going to happen is that foot would hold a lot of moisture in it where the walls will dry out faster. So when the walls become dry and this little foot, which is much thicker, has water in it or moisture in it, it's going to crack because there's a difference of wall thickness. So the way to alleviate that is to create this inside cavity, which brings down the inner portion of this down to the same wall thickness of the rest of the bowl, and it essentially makes the ring or the foot of this bowl at about the same wall thickness as the bowl as well. So with everything having evenly thick walls, it will also dry evenly, and hopefully there won't be any cracking. Now this is a reversed shaving cut. I'm only using that bottom wing. You want to be really delicate when you do that. You don't want to get too aggressive and put the tool in there and have it touch anything else, because it's very easy to get a catch. I'm going to switch over to my spindle detail gouge and work this nub down. The spindle detail gouge is great because it can get into these tight spots, and that's what I use it for. I use it for the angle, for the tenon, and for these nubs. Remember, don't ever use a spindle gouge for doing any kind of roughing or any kind of main work on your bowl. But small detail like this is fine. So what I'm going to do is apply forward pressure and turn the lathe off, and the tip of that will cut that nub and sever it. And just pop that right off of there. Now the thing I like to do is I'll use that jam chuck with my 4-jaw chuck and use that as a stand for the bowl so that I can work the base of it. I can go ahead and drop that piece of foam on there again, which that's what I used in the jam chuck itself. You want to be really careful here not to bump the bark edge on anything, because it's still fragile. It'll always be fragile, and there still could come off. But the fact that it stayed on this long is actually really, really nice. So I'm going to take a little bit of time here and just use the edge of the pad to smooth off the interior of the foot. And then I'll take a little more time and use my woodburning tool to sign the bottom of the bowl. I like using a chisel point. Gives me nice, clean, crisp lines. All right, so I'm going to use tried and true Danish oil. This is 100% boiled linseed oil. This is boiled in the kind of the old world manner. This is not boiled, and this is not like any other product that you can buy at a box store or any other product that's called Danish oil. Unfortunately, the finishes don't have any kind of regulation on them as far as how they name themselves. So a Danish oil, if you line up 10 different Danish oils that you could buy at the store, every one of them could potentially have different ingredients in it. But this is essentially pure boiled linseed oil and nothing else. That's why I use it. And there'll be a link for this and all the products that I use in the description for this video. Look at that wood grain just come to life with this oil. Absolutely gorgeous. I'm just putting a very light coat, just enough that it's on the surface. If you see this oil on the surface, you have enough.
And the way this Danish oil works is you can let it sit for about 10 minutes and then use a clean cloth and wipe off any excess and then just let it cure. It takes 72 hours for it to cure, and then you can apply another coat if you'd like. The reason I like using the Danish oil, the tried and true Danish oil for this, is the fact that it's somewhat more liquid and it makes it easy for me to get this finish down into that bark. I like to finish the bark as well. I don't want that bark drying out and being unprotected without finish on it, because it will get damaged over time. Wow, look at that. Look at the texture. Look at the patterns of this wood grains. Absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely beautiful. And again, that contrast with the heartwood to the sapwood is just amazing. See, here I'm taking my time to get this bark edge. You want to be careful you don't put too much on there and have excess. You want to wipe away any excess and get in there and get any thick areas cleared up, because if it stays on too thick, it will not cure properly and it'll become gunky and sticky. So you want to take your time and really get this into all those crevices, but not in an excessive amount. That bowl is looking incredible. The simplicity of that curve, look at that. Wow. And look at the bark layer. The bark layers in here are crazy. Oh, the heartwood in this is so gorgeous. There's the bark layers. Look at the layers, how those layers are in there. Absolutely gorgeous. Oh, I'm super happy with this piece.
Well, here it is, and it looks like the bark's going to stay on, which is fantastic. That doesn't always happen that way, especially with big bark like this. This was an older tree, and for some reason, it's kind of escaped my observation that there are lots of layers in the bark. So the bark is maturing with the tree, which we kind of know that obviously, because a walnut tree or say a black cherry tree has a really thin skinned bark when it's young, but as it gets older, it has deeper grooved bark. That makes me want to look into that a little bit more, which means that everything's coming from this cambium layer, which is fascinating. So this cambium layer is putting new growth rings on the tree, and it's putting more growth on the bark as well, which is really, really cool. So trees never cease to amaze me. I love everything about trees, and wow, look at this bowl. Isn't this awesome? Thanks again, Chuck, for bringing this piece of walnut from Ohio. I greatly appreciate that. Now this has tried and true Danish oil on it, which is pure linseed oil. I've got a video all about that. You can check it out. This will most likely soak that up pretty quickly. The other thing to keep in mind too, this wood is somewhat moist still. It's still wet from being cut just recently within a few months. It retains a lot of moisture for a long period of time. So this initial coat of Danish oil is going to help it ease into the drying process. So as it's releasing moisture, it will still release moisture with that oil on it, but it will slow that process down and it will allow it to be a little bit more even, and you won't have as many dramatic drying experiences that can cause cracking, and we don't want that obviously. So it's a great idea, even if you don't sand it, it's a great idea to put some type of penetrating oil on your bowl if it's wet and you've once turned it like this. That's going to help that drying process just a little bit. But what I'm going to do is, as this dries, this is going to soak this up. Remember, this end grain here is like cut off straws on both sides of the bowl. They're going to soak that up really quick. So I would guess in a couple hours, these are going to look really dry and the whole thing will look dry again. Well, I'll let this go for the recommended curing time, which is 72 hours, and then I'll apply another coat. And I'll let it go again, and I'll apply another coat. The idea is to build up those layers and let them cure, and then have this nice finish on there, but you also want that oil down into the wood protecting it. So that's the whole point of that. But look at that bark, and look how thick that bark is right there. You've got to be really careful with this edge too. Hopefully as this dries, it's going to contract a little bit, and hopefully as it contracts, it doesn't break this off. The other thing that I've done here too, which you may not have noticed, I've made this foot a little bit taller than it necessarily has to be. Although it actually is kind of proportioned pretty nice. It's a relatively small foot. It does make it a little bit tippy, but it's not too bad. And it makes it look a little bit more dramatic when you have this size of a bowl with the foot that size. But this foot is a little bit taller as well. So if this bowl contracts a lot and distorts this base, it makes it wobbly on the tabletop, well, I can bring this right back to a sander and just sand that off. And actually, you can make a free sander to do just this with your lathe, and I've got a video all about that here, so you can check that out too. So anyway, there's a lot of lessons in here, a lot of really fun, cool things to do. I love turning live edge bowls. Absolutely gorgeous. Everyone loves them, and it's so cool to see. It's kind of like looking at a cross section of a tree when you're just like looking right into the tree and seeing this bowl. So I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did, and if you did, do me a huge favor and click that like button. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you doing that, and make sure you're subscribing if you're not already subscribing, and check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got everything you need to learn about turning wood bowls, including online courses that you could take right now and accelerate your skills and techniques very quickly, so you can turn bowls like this as well. So check it out, turnawoodbowl.com. All right, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy turning.